The Hero's Journey, a Mindful Accord podcast, with your host, Rich Decker.
Thank you for taking some of your valuable time to listen to the show. My guest today is Greg Burdulis, who is a former Chaplin and Buddhist monk who spent 8 years in intensive silent meditation practice in Burma. After returning to the States to see his dying father, Greg decided to set down the robes and pick up some business books. He started his own consulting practice to help companies embrace and learn meditation and mindfulness practices for their employees. In addition, he has a private mindfulness practice called The Power of Presence, where he coaches individuals and groups in a variety of mindfulness practices and methods. He's currently working on a new project called Monk and Shrink. This is a pioneering company that combines ancient meditation practices with modern psychiatry. It is delivered through a discrete and interactive online program to treat depression and other distressing disorders. I first heard about Greg when I saw a YouTube video from a TEDx talk he gave in Boulder, Colorado. I was so moved by his talk that I felt compelled to call him and speak with him. Now, we've since become friends, but there is an interesting aspect that I learned in this interview that I didn't know about Greg. And that is, although he has spent years in meditation and mindfulness practices, and he was a monk in Burma in mostly silence for 8 years, he's had a lifelong struggle with depression. Greg is a fascinating person, and when you hear him speak, you will feel the compassion coming through your speakers or headphones. It's my great honor to present the Hero's Journey of Greg Burdulis. Well, thank you, Greg. Thank you for joining us today on the podcast. I'm very pleased to have everyone hear your story, and I'm excited to hear your story, at least more of your story.
Thank you for inviting me, Rich, and you're welcome. And I like the idea that the two of us are going to unfold parts of my history that might be interesting to you and your listeners.
Oh, I guarantee it will be interesting to me and our listeners. I guarantee it. So let's start at the beginning of your journey. Can you tell us about your childhood, where you grew up, and then maybe a principle or two that your parents passed along to you that you still carry with you today?
Yeah. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, a city with many lakes and quite beautiful, although I didn't know it was beautiful when I was young because I took it for granted. And I grew up catching snakes and fishing and on those lakes, and then ice skating in the winter. And one of the things that I think my parents passed on to me, my father in particular, although I see it in my mother too now, is an element of being frugal so that money is not poorly spent, and nothing was lavish when I was growing up. I wouldn't say that we were poor, because I always had enough to eat and there was a roof over our heads, but we weren't wealthy like some of my friends who had toys, the kind that I could only dream of, but I, nor my brothers, nor my sisters would have. The difficulty with frugality is finding the line between it and miserliness, it and stinginess. And I have definitely been on the wrong side of that line. And yet there was a time where I was living in Burma where there was no income for 10 years. And I never felt want for anything. So I'm continuing to learn about the value of money and the value of being frugal and the value of having few wants or needs.
Now, how many brothers and sisters do you have?
So had 3 sisters, have 2 brothers, and the 3 sisters were older and the 2 brothers are younger, which means that the 3 girls were first, followed by the 3 boys, and I was the first of the boys. and also in the middle with one of the sisters.
So in a family of 6, I guess frugality isn't always such a bad thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't say frugality is bad, not at all, which didn't mean that I didn't want things that I couldn't have. And learning that didn't destroy me was part of learning to get along without things that I may have only thought I wanted because somebody else had.
But you didn't need.
But I didn't need.
Now, would you say that you had the typical American upbringing?
Well, you better describe that to me.
So you a family of 6, mom stayed at home, dad worked, that kind of thing?
Yeah. In that respect, yes.
So when you were growing up and you were a teenager, were you still going to school in Madison in high school?
Yeah, I went to a Catholic grade school and a Catholic high school, but by the time I was a junior, I was sort of in a James Dean mode, and it was either explode or get the hell out of there. So I ended up being an exchange student in Switzerland for my senior year of high school, which, by the way, I never graduated from high school, but that didn't seem to matter when I applied for college.
It didn't really? You didn't graduate?
That's right. My senior year in Switzerland didn't translate into a senior year at the high school.
That's interesting. So the college just looked past that, or?
Yeah.
Now, when you were growing up, you had said you had your James Dean era and you did the exchange student. What did you see for Greg? What did you envision for your future?
Well, I remember having some notion that meditation was important, but my father, being a psychologist, more or less poo-pooed the idea. I remember him showing me an article in Time magazine that says that science was telling us that meditation was not that different from sleep, so you might as well go to sleep. And my father, being a psychologist, I came to realize later that his studies about the psyche, about consciousness, came during the 50s and, mostly during the late 40s and 50s, which is when the whole notion of medicine was focused on what was wrong with people and pathology. And so he didn't have the same kind of inner orientation that I had around the inner life. And I need to be careful with that. He may have, but the way that he was educated taught him about pathology instead of the possibilities of using the inner life as a source of happiness, as a way of connecting to all life through all time, and as a way of living with a wide, open, spacious possibility of what life is about. And one of the downsides of that, I'd like to mention right away, is this sense of uncertainty, of not knowing, of not having the answer. And it takes a while, I think, for people raised in our culture to adjust to that reality. At least that's what I consider my current reality, that I don't get answers. And being able to live openly with that is extremely fruitful to me.
You know, it's interesting that you brought that up. And I think no matter how smart you are, your environment has such a huge influence on your thinking and your beliefs and everything. It's almost inescapable to a certain extent.
Yeah, the research that I'm doing, I have created another company, and we are going to be presenting mindfulness and psychiatry on an online platform that allows for social interaction and anonymity, and for people who suffer from depression and anxiety. And I want to make a short aside about this, because depression and anxiety have been two symptoms that I have suffered from in the past, which is partly why my heart goes out to others who have those aspects of life as part of their everyday world, because it's tough as hell. And that's part of why I want to reach out to them. But I'm bringing up this notion of this company because I'm doing research on depression and anxiety. And it shows, the research is telling us that having depression when we're young strongly increases the likelihood that we'll have it again later in life. And that the circumstances we grew up in have a massive effect on depression and anxiety, such that it changes the brain so that depression and anxiety actually become more possible.
Now, is it a matter of the chicken or the egg? Is the research show that someone's susceptible to depression and anxiety, or because they experience this at a younger age, that then in later age that their brain's wired for it? Is there any indication of that?
If I understand correctly, then the research does indicate that if you have been depressed when you are young, it is more likely that you will be depressed later.
So you're just kind of like wiring the brain for depression.
Yes.
In a way. Wow,
yes.
Very interesting. So what attracted you to psychology? Because your father was a psychiatrist when you went to school?
Yeah. So first of all, my father was a psychologist, different psychiatrist. Yeah, no problem. Secondly, yeah, I think that there was an interest in that because that's what he did, which was weird because I couldn't tell my friends what my father did. Whereas, the plumber, the kid who's the son of the plumber, he could describe what his father did. And I go into the basement and I can see plumbing. I get it. But my dad, I don't really know what he does. But I also want to say that part of what was inspirational was that he was working in fields where he was helpful to people. And being helpful was part of his value for what he had to contribute to the world. So contributing something positive to the world was part of his value. So these are part of what were sort of an unspoken ambience in my family, at least professionally from my father. But I want to talk about two specific incidents that were surprising to me in how they turned me towards psychology. And one was when I was 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, perhaps, and I went with my father to a Boy Scout event where we were racing these rocket ships that were propelled by rubber bands. I don't need to go into describing what the race was more than that. But as I was talking with my dad, I said, I don't feel very good. I think I should go home. And he said, that is nervousness. And it was the first time that there was any sense that nervousness could be a symptom, but not me. And it was my father's labeling of my experience that helped me to stay there, go through what was happening, not just leave because I felt sick. And I'm not saying that the nervousness disappeared, but it became manageable. So that was one event. The second event was when I was little, I fell off a ladder and crashed my head into a flower pot, and there was a bump on my head months after this accident. And I had started combing my hair differently. And I asked my dad what he thought of it because he combed his hair every day and he was the most handsome man in the world. So I needed to have his opinion. And he said something like, well, did you start parting your hair on the other side so that when you combed it, it would cover the bump on your head? And I didn't actually know if that was what caused me to comb my hair differently, it made a certain amount of sense, but I didn't have conscious awareness of that motivation. To this day, I can't say for sure that that is why I started combing my hair differently, but the question of his indicated to me that there could be motivations for my behavior that I wasn't aware of. And I found that fascinating, a little scary, but overall, really interesting. So those are two of the main pieces of direct contact with my father that also sort of opened psychology as an interesting way of moving through the world and being helpful to others.
I always wondered, because I got a degree in psychology, and
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I always think the main reason I got a degree in psychology because I was trying to understand myself.
Yes, I completely get that, Rich, and I think that was certainly true for my father too.
Oh, really? What about for yourself?
Well, I don't actually have a degree in psychology.
Oh, you don't?
No, I have a degree in counseling, and I have a degree in dance, and I have a degree in spirituality, and then certificates and trainings in coaching primarily.
Now, where did you go to school at in college?
I went 1 year at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I found the form of education so disjointed that I ended up going to a school out in Washington State, the Evergreen State College, which had programs that had a variety of subjects, but they were all interrelated, and that was part of the orientation. And that was much more my style.
Now, when you got out of school, where did you do then? I know you did some traveling, yes?
Yeah, well, at that time, one of my dance teachers said, Greg, you should go to LA or New York, wait tables, whatever, and dance. And I was really interested in dance, but not going to New York or LA or waiting tables. So at that time, I was teaching mountaineering, and I shifted the space of dance from the studio to the mountain. And so I continued to be very active outside and be connecting to people and connecting to nature. So that's actually what I did for a long time.
Now, what appealed to you studying dance?
There's an element of creativity that's linked with the body that is particularly compelling to me. I would watch football with Dad, and he would say, there, that was graceful. And he was the only man I knew who would use the word graceful to describe something that was happening in something as violent as football. And he could see grace. He was also a very strong athlete. And so his athleticism and his appreciation for beautiful movement and for watching figure skating were things that I connected with too. They resonated in me. So being an athlete, being a dancer, and being connected to the body were important ways, either part of what he passed on through his genes or through his role modeling.
Now, was the depression and anxiety showing itself at that time?
No. It showed up when I turned 40, after I was living in Arizona, sun country, and moved back to the Midwest to study to be a chaplain. That's when depression hit the first time. And man, I had no idea what was going on with me. And it took me down hard, Rich. Like, I didn't know that there are places that are deeper than black, darker than black.
So it hit you hard then.
Hard, man, hard. Rich, I didn't have self-suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation, but I do remember saying, man, if a bus hit me, I don't think I would have the initiative or the interest or the energy to heal.
Thing I wanted to ask you, going back just a step, I read somewhere where you said during your travels you made a living as a storyteller, and I'm curious what that living was.
Yeah. Well, actually, that happened mostly after I traveled the world. I came back to the U.S. and I started telling stories, and I told stories well enough that I could tell a story about myself being a storyteller, and the Arizona Commission on the Arts hired me. And so I went to tell stories in schools and in Mexico through the Arizona Commission on the Arts, and I helped students develop their powers of storytelling.
Well, that's pretty amazing that's actually a paid position.
I know.
Right?
I know.
Well, storytelling is so much of a part of the human experience. I mean, our lives are the stories we tell ourselves. And it's all stories.
Yeah, Rich, that's such a great understanding. And it helps us begin to have the notion that if I told a different story, I could be living a different life. And for many of us, that is a brand new thought. But being able to have a sense of the story of our lives is what we live, then that opens up the possibility of telling different stories.
Now, have you read the book Sapiens?
No.
Yeah.
No.
I would highly recommend it. It's an incredible book. It's by Yuval Noah Harari. It came out a few years ago, but his theory in that book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, his theory is that our ability to tell stories is what separated us from the rest of the species, because we were just one of actually 6 different species of humans, and Homo sapiens was rather not anything special, but he believes that there was a mutation and we could start telling stories, and that's what really separated us from the rest of the species on the planet. It's a great book.
Okay, I will look that up when we're done.
Great. Now, going back to your 40s, what triggered the depression? What triggered that darkness?
Rich, I think there's 2 things now that I have 20 years to look back on it. And these are 2 things that I would not have named then. The first was moving back to the Midwest and encountering winter. Winter here is primarily gray. There's not that much difference between daylight and dark, except for variations or gradations of light. And I didn't spend much time outside either. It was so cold. So I believe that's one aspect. And since returning to the Midwest, where I've been in Indiana for a couple of years, the depression has also returned. But I want to pause on that. We can pick that up later if you like. The other thing that I think was important at that time is a young man, like a couple years younger than I, who I had such esteem for and such respect. He was articulate, he was intelligent, he was ultra creative, and he was so handsome too. I remember I met him at school at the Evergreen State College, and there were women I knew who called him Apollo because he was so handsome. And the eyes would just gravitate to this man, not only because of his physical beauty, but there was a sense of power that wasn't ever the kind of power that would be used over you. So it wasn't the kind of power that anybody feared, but there was a quality to this man that was alluring. And fortunately, he and I became dear friends. And during his return to school to get a master's in art, he hung himself. And it rocked my world. And it caused a hole in my soul. And I think my soul deflated. And I asked a man who also knew him and appreciated him greatly, I asked him, how can he make sense of Michael's death? And this man said, I don't. And it was the first time that somebody had held open the door to mystery and uncertainty and didn't expect himself to understand or know, and didn't expect himself to have an opinion or to be even educated about something. And it was okay for him not to know. And it is as though grief poured through that little doorway and to some extent deflated my being. And I can still feel elements of that sorrow today. And my non-understanding of his choice and how he would get to a place. And this is my supposition, I don't know if it's accurate, that the suffering was so intense that the best option he could come up with was to end it. And it aches my heart to imagine that he would hurt so much.
Did you have any indication that he was suffering like he was? Or did he hide it very well?
Well, we had had conversations where he had spoken to me about what seemed like an unnatural optimism, or at least an optimism that he didn't understand and he didn't feel. So he was referring to what he saw and felt in me. But Rich, that was about the extent of it, was that discussion.
So his act was a complete surprise to you. You did not expect anything even remotely like that.
Yeah.
So those two things in conjunction, you think is what really triggered the depression?
Well, Rich, I would bet 80% on that. I don't know quite how to talk about that. I think 80% sure.
So when you were going through this depression, were you a practicer of meditation at that point or no?
No, Rich, it's much more like that experience of depression kicked my ass into gear. So that this paddling around with meditation, this piddling about, this pretending that I know what I'm doing, I couldn't pretend that anymore. And it is a large part of what launched me into intensive practice.
So without the depression, you wouldn't have probably turned to meditation?
Well, if you recall, Rich, there was interest before, even when I was a teenager. So there was interest in meditation, but I don't think I would have meditated with the intensity that I felt I needed to save my life.
Right. Now, why did you choose meditation as typical cure now is just go get some pills? Now,
yeah, well, I tried that.
Oh, you did?
Oh, yeah. And the pills were helpful. I was interested in knowing if there's some sort of darker element within that needed healing that just would be covered up if the pills took the symptoms away. So that was part of what was going on. Another part was, by that time, Rich, I had lived in this free fall of darkness long enough that I'd given up so much about our culture and in terms of what's important or what's valuable or the kind of car to drive and how much money to make and where to live. All that kind of stuff had no influence on me. And I was deep enough inside that it became slowly apparent that this inner space is workable in the sense that a person can abide there. In the past, it only seemed like water and going underwater, I was afraid I couldn't breathe. I remember actually having a dream in which I was underwater and surprised myself with breathing. In a way, I think that was the gift of depression, is learning that I could breathe underwater. Our man Joseph Campbell talks about the difference between a mystic and a crazy person. They're both over their head in mystery, but one of them knows how to swim.
That's a great description. That's pretty accurate. I would imagine one of them knows how to swim. So you were struggling with the depression. You were studying to become a chaplain, you said?
Yeah.
Did you become a chaplain?
Yes.
And were you still dealing with that deep level of depression?
Yes.
Oh, you were. Now, when you're studying to be a chaplain, what is the denomination?
I was at a hospital, which is where the program was, and there was no denomination that needed to be specified.
I see. So, but it was Christian-based, or?
Well, the education was Christian-based. I mean, it comes out of a Christian tradition, but it is not limited to that at all. So nowadays, there's Jewish chaplains, Buddhist chaplains, Native American chaplains.
Oh, I see. Okay. I guess I didn't understand it completely. So they were open to the idea of meditation and all of that. Then.
Well, Rich, I want to say that this part of my life happened before intensive meditation. Before I went to Burma. But to answer your question, yes, they were open-minded. And at that time, more of an artist than a Buddhist.
I see. More of an artist than a Buddhist. So what led you to Buddhism then?
I left the U.S. with a girlfriend to travel to Asia. And she was interested in the Tibetan Buddhism because there's a big flock of Tibetan Buddhists in Madison, Wisconsin. And I followed her interest partly because it already resonated with me from when I was younger. And there's something kind of both compelling and sexy about Zen in my mind and heart. So studying with the Tibetans was as close as I could get, and that was mighty fine because I was learning a lot. And I was doing a retreat that in the Tibetan tradition is traditionally done to prepare one for learning to meditate. And it was during that retreat that our small group had an audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the main thing that I heard him say was that meditation will transform your mind. And I knew that's what I needed to do, Rich. I just didn't know where or how or who to ask for help. Well, that very day, I met an American woman who had ordained in Burma. I told her I wanted to meditate. She said, Burma, go to Burma. I said, okay, where is it? Because I had no idea. My ignorance continues to be vast. In fact, Rich, it's getting bigger. But at that time, it wasn't too far away from where I was. And so I got to Burma. I started practicing meditation, and there were a number of experiences that happened where I realized I don't understand this, and I know this is my path.
What happened to the girlfriend?
Well, she wanted to return to the U.S. I was nowhere near ready. So we split up in Nepal.
Seems like a kind of important character in your life. Do you have any idea where she is today?
Yeah. She is in Madison, and she has a dear boyfriend, and she and he are both involved with meditation. And the last I heard, they continued to be involved with the Tibetans.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, that's great that you can still stay in contact. So you decided to go to Burma. Did you decide, is that when you knew you were going to be a monk, or was that later?
Well, that was later. Not much later, though. I mean, I was a monk within a couple of months. Part of what was going on for me is that I learned that the Burmese monks, the Theravadan tradition, you can ordain as many times as you want, which means you can disrobe as many times as you want. I didn't know that, partly because the Zen tradition and the Tibetan tradition are different. There you ordain with the intention of remaining that way for the rest of your life, and that was just way too long for me to make a commitment about the rest of my life. So in the Theravadan tradition, there are men in Burma who ordain for 10 days every year. And they shave their heads, they take the precepts, they put on the robes, and they practice for 10 days, and then they disrobe and do a different set of precepts and return to their families and businesses. And I thought, well, I like that kind of open-ended quality. So that was part of it. Part of it was, Rich, doing intensive practice was really difficult for me, and I needed all the help I could get. And in that tradition, monks are considered sons of the Buddha. And I thought, okay, give me that name. Maybe that will help. Help! And the other reason, Rich, is because when people line up for food in that tradition at a monastery or a meditation center, well, the monks are first, and that was important.
Food?
Yeah.
I know the Tibetans say it, and there's many others, but those are the two biggest driving forces in our lives and almost all species, sex and food. So that would make sense.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So was it the depression, or did that start to lift, or was it the difficulties with meditation that, because, I mean, deciding to become a monk is a pretty big decision. So what drove that?
Well, Rich, first of all, when you're there in Burma, it's not such a big decision.
Oh, okay.
By the time you get there and you have a sense of what meditation can do for you, and it is as though your future opens up in a way that it never had before. Like right now, I'm looking outside and I can see the blue sky. Back then, Rich, the blue sky was part of my heart. Or there was no difference between my heart and the blue sky. And it was not a big step. I mean, it's true that I wouldn't have sex and I wouldn't interact with women very much and I wouldn't be dancing and I would have very little exercise and I'd only eat 2 meals a day and I didn't get to choose the food I ate. These are things that people in this culture would consider a quality of deprivation. To do without those would be to be deprived. And yet, Rich, for me, I could get it. Why those things are distracting.
I see. Yeah.
And I did not want to be distracted. I wanted to give everything I could to this path. And so it was not a deprivation to give those things up. It was, listen to this, Rich, it was worth it. The opposite of deprivation.
Right. Let me ask you something. So if someone is like yourself and they're struggling with depression in a deep, dark place like you were, but they don't want to become a monk, what would you suggest to them for meditation? What would you say for someone like that if they don't want to do the drugs, but they want to find another way? How should they approach it?
Okay, so first of all, my heart would go out to him or her. Let's pretend it's a him. Just it'll ease my language. Secondly, I would not automatically suggest meditation without a teacher or without a community, without a therapist, and without at least considering medicine that would help stabilize the brain chemistry. And to be honest, Rich, I would say you come and do our course. The course that I was referring to earlier, the course with a psychiatrist, which, by the way, we call Monk and Shrink.
Monk and Shrink. Awesome name. That's a great name. That's the name of it, Monk and Shrink?
That's the name of the company, yeah.
Oh, Monk and Shrink. That's pretty awesome.
Okay, but Rich, wait, I wanna come back to your question because to me it's a serious question and I don't have a pat answer. I would really want to have a or several conversations with this person to get a sense of where he is at, what his interests are, what his fears are, and if it's possible to consider that even though there's tremendous suffering, that there's nothing wrong, and that this is part of the path, that going through hell is part of the path, and it doesn't mean he's wrong or stupid or bad or inadequate by any means. I'm not saying that this is easy or pleasant. I'm saying it's not wrong. And I want to know if there's any part of him that hears that message, because that would be a part of him that can open up and begin to blossom under the right conditions, with the right people around and the right forms of mental training. That can open up from just being a sliver of the sky to his whole heart.
Well, I think it's important, like you said, the depression is part of the path, it's part of the hero's journey. But, you know, in our culture, at least, we're so geared towards this pleasure and happiness and everything that happiness isn't always sustainable. So when you feel bad, it doesn't mean it is bad. It's just part of the experience.
Yeah, great. And I would add to what you're saying, when you feel bad, it doesn't mean that you are bad.
Yeah.
And see, this is one of the great distinctions that mindfulness and meditation help to clarify. That there can be sensations like pain, and there can be thoughts like I'm no good, and there can be feelings like anxiety, sadness, and disappointment, and none of those are you. And for a person who's in depression, that is a massive insight. Although it just feels, at the first time that you get a sense of that, it feels like a door creaked open and you didn't even know that doorway existed. I remember the day that happened for me, Rich. I was sitting on the dock talking with a friend who was also a counselor. I was telling him what was going on for me, and he said simply, "That sounds like depression talking." Bam! Like when my father told me about nervousness, when he named the illness and he clarified a distinction between the illness and me, for the first time I realized I am not depression. Before that, I didn't know that, Rich. I was depressed, I was bad, I was wrong, I was somehow no good, or otherwise I wouldn't be feeling so bad.
So that moment on the dock is when you had a bit of a departure from the self, in a way.
Yes. Yeah. In another way, Rich, the way it showed up for me is like that door opened, I could see a sliver of sky blue, which later became the vision and the felt sense around my heart, or where my heart would be. Now there's sky.
That's a great description. So who are you now, then? Who would you say you are?
Oh, I laugh just to consider it because it's kind of a joke.
Is there a you?
Well, there's a you in the sense that there's a difference between Rich Decker and Greg Burdulis. Is there a you deeper than that? Like, that is the central point between these pieces of the triangle of sensations, thoughts, and emotions. Rich, every time I seek the you, all I come up with are, well, there are these components, but is there a central me that is distinct from these components? Rich, the best answer I've got so far is no. However, Rich, I also want to say, I'm interested to see what happens when the body dies. Like, I'm so curious about that part of existence. What happens?
Are you convinced that there is something? Or you just believe it?
Well, it makes sense to me that in the same way that the molecules become worms and earth and plants, in the same way that that happens, I have some sense that the consciousness within me also returns to a bigger realm of consciousness, not unlike water in the form of a raindrop, losing the raindrop self in the ocean and becoming more of what it already is as water.
Well, we're all going to find out.
That's
I
right.
know that much. The only thing I know for sure is we're going to find out.
But Rich, here's one of the things that I think mindfulness and meditation help with is developing an open attitude, even a curiosity about death. That is not morbid. It's an understanding that this life, as I know it, will end. That much I know. I don't know much beyond that. And so that frame of reference of the temporality of this life helps me to prioritize what's actually important to me, which, Rich, at 59 years old, one of my highest values is kindness. Now, I am not saying that I am an adept or any form of expert. I am a beginner. However, what I do know is that this is an important value of mine, and I need to be careful of getting too possessive about it by calling it mine, but I also don't want to get stuck with language, so I'm just going to keep talking. This sense of kindness, allowing that to be the main way that I interact with this world, that to me is lovely. And by the way, it would be lovely if that were the orientation that other people had. But I don't get to control what orientation and motivation they have. I do get to control that which I have, or at least I get to steer it. And being kind or offering kindness and its brothers and sisters, generosity, forgiveness, understanding, encouragement, laughter, this makes deep sense to me.
Well, that's a good way. That's a good way. But you said the depression when you moved back to Indiana, or you went to Indiana, that it came back a little bit. Is the kindness keep that at bay, or?
Rich, good question. This is an important place to go because no, Rich, the kindness, the generosity, the love of my wife, those did not stop depression from returning. And I was starting to feel miserable again. Rich, there was a time in Burma where I said out loud to myself all alone, I will never feel depressed again. Because that sky blue heart, that sky spacious heart was so certain of itself that depression would never return. But it did. And I became aware, mainly through my relationship with my sweetheart, that I was feeling miserable, being miserable, and miserable to be around. So that kindness, generosity, and the love that I was talking about, those shriveled. There wasn't much left. Instead of a vibrant plant, there were black leaves shriveled up on the soil.
So where are you at now?
Now, I would say that depression is an illness that is being managed. And part of the management was being with a counselor and a therapist and sort of looking inside together. And part of it was, with her help, noticing my aversion to taking medicine, noticing my aversion to the DIY man stooping to take medicine instead of fixing this all by himself. And instead, with her gracious generosity, saying, okay, I'll try medicine and see if it helps. And Rich, it did. And I think it still does. So I've been using medicine for going on a year now.
And it's made a difference.
Yes, Rich. In fact, within 24 hours,
wow,
it made a difference.
Hours.
But Rich, I also want to tell you how I get to this place, because I know why people would balk at taking medicine, because I did at least. But I also want to say, Rich, if the medicine helps me be better in this world, better in the sense of more generous, more kind, more forgiving, more encouraging towards others, then it's worth it, because the medicine, the benefits of the medicine are not just for me to be happy. That might be enough just by itself. However, it's much bigger than me. And when I see it from that perspective, there's a sense of, right, this isn't about me. It's bigger than that.
So you see that taking drugs, not just for you, but for those around you as well.
Oh, yeah, Rich.
Yeah.
Very clearly.
Well, that's important too, because we're always trapped in the self so often. Even if you rationalize, oh, there's no me, there's no self, but 2 seconds later, you're trapped in it. So that's important to remember.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. Thanks for that reminder.
Yeah, I need it all the time.
Yeah. Okay. And by the way, bravo, because you get to see it. 99% of us don't get to see it like you do, Rich.
Well,
how fortunate you are.
Indeed. But like yourself, I had to go through self-created hell, but I had to go through absolute misery for decades until I could finally break free. But
oh, Rich, I'm so glad you're doing this work.
Yeah,
and
me
that
too.
You're bringing what you use to break free, you're bringing that out into the world and offering it to others. Way to go, Rich. I applaud what you're doing so thoroughly and deeply.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, let's get back to you. So you're in Burma. You come back to the States because your father was dying. Is that correct?
That's right.
And did you have anything you had to resolve with your father, or was your relationship pretty good? No.
We were very good.
Okay.
It seemed clear to him he wanted to die. He was done with life. I was ready to let him go. I understand that life ends. If he's good with it, I'm good with it.
Yeah. But what caused you to decide it's time to move on and lay down the robes?
Rich, one of the things that was important to me was a sense of being able to join the flow of generosity in this universe. Like the sun that I'm looking at right now, it is shining in a way that makes a lot of sense to me, is that it is extremely generous. It's just pouring its light and heat out. In the same way, the rice plants where I was living, they are growing up and producing rice that feeds this body. The earth is being generous. And the rain that comes down out of the sky and it finds its way into my cup, and I drink the rain. The water is being generous. And the air itself, Rich, every time I've needed to inhale, there has been air. Every single time. The air is being generous. When there's such a clear understanding of how I am being lifted up by the generosity of this universe, there's this desire to join that flow, not out of debt, not because I owe it, but because, whoa, that looks fulfilling. That looks like fun isn't really the right word. Fulfilling is much closer. And still, fun has its own way of describing what I'm talking about. So, Rich, I wanted to be generous in a bigger way than being a hermit in Burma. So giving up the robes was part of being more engaged in the world. The second part was, Rich, the domain of intimacy has huge areas for me to learn. And the kind of intimacy, the love relationship that could offer me the learning that I sought was not going to happen when I was a monk. And a few years later, after I disrobed, I met the woman that I, in fact, later married. So it's my first marriage, and I say it's my last.
How did you meet?
I met her dancing.
Oh, back to the dancing. Oh, the circle of life. Right. The circle of life.
Yeah. Rich, I want to say one thing about her. And then there's one thing I want to say about the hero's journey too. Is now the time?
Sure. Go right ahead.
Yeah. So this thing about Marielle, Rich, I know from experience and intuition that deep down, this woman is kind. I'm not saying that that's how she acts on the surface or on the everyday, but I know deep down, kindness is already there. And I remember telling her some things that I was ashamed of. And Rich, it seemed to me that her heart threw open its arms and ran towards me. So it took me decades to both find her and be ready for this kind of commitment. Because being a monk is kind of special. You're a special guy as a monk. And there's an ego boost from that. Being a married man who's a householder and making a living in the world, there's no big ego boost from that. And it took a while to be able to realize, hey, that's where my learning is. Whether it's flashy or not, that's where I'm going. Okay, so that's the comment about Marielle and marriage. Here's the thing I wanted to say about the hero's journey. So I want to tell the hero's journey in a few short sentences and then apply my understanding of that to my life. Is that all right?
Sure, please.
Okay, so the hero leaves the town where he grew up. I'm going to use the word he, though the word shiro and women go through precisely the same version of a shiro's journey in their own way. But I'm going to speak in the masculine form right now. The hero goes out on adventures, encounters demons and encounters mentors. And the hero wins boons or gifts that he brings back to the village or the community that he left in the first place. The hero's journey isn't complete until the return. And Rich, when I heard that my father was sick and he might be dying, I didn't want to leave Burma. I was a happy monk. And when I saw the return as perhaps one of the cycles of hero's journey for me to bring to the people of my culture what I learned in Burma, in the monasteries, in the cave, and in the hermitage, then there was an opening inside. There was an acceptance. There was an, okay, I'll go back. And so to some extent, my work in the world is the continuation of that hero's journey, is to bring to the people the beauty and the power, the humility and the happiness that show up with the blue sky heart.
Now, when you came back, you started a company that was helping organizations in corporate America embrace this, what you learned in the caves and the hermitage. Are you still doing that?
I do.
You do.
Yes,
That's the power of presence. Is that correct?
Correct. You got it, Rich.
I know that the corporate America and the business world is beginning to embrace these concepts, but it's still got a long way to go, I'm assuming. What's been the biggest challenge you've experienced in doing that?
Rich, the biggest challenge for me is that the people are going into mindfulness for reasons that are related to the bottom line. Because they will be more productive, or their workers will be more productive or more engaged or happier. All of these things are true. And I'm glad that mindfulness has a doorway into the corporate world to affect these human beings. However, what I consider the true richness of mindfulness is not described with words like productivity and workplace enhancement and improved communications. I'm not saying those don't happen. I'm saying that that is not the deeper richness of what is available through becoming awake. So I feel my current conclusion is that I've not been able to touch that level of human beings in the corporate situations long enough or deep enough or authentically enough to offer them a glimpse of what is possible so that they continue to practice and benefit.
So do you feel it's worthwhile, or do you feel like you're trying to put a square peg into a round hole?
It is worthwhile because they're still human beings. And they're human beings who make decisions that affect a lot of us. And when I say us, I'm referring to more than humans. And I fully believe that mindfulness helps us connect with our hearts and connect to a bigger picture than me, or my company. And in that way, decisions can be made that are more beneficial for all of us instead of just a few. And so for that reason alone, Rich, I would go into places like Monsanto, like Coca-Cola, like the U.S. military, because those human beings have just as much opportunity to awaken as anyone else because they're human. Now, they may have had conditioning that turns them away from this kind of thing. I understand. But Rich, when I can talk one-on-one with people, we can make connections where the deeper parts of them feel safe to come forward and to be part of a discussion that goes beyond the normal conversation.
Well, then tell us about Monk and Shrink. This is a new endeavor you've begun. I'm very curious. What's the difference between what you've been doing in the corporate world and Monk and Shrink?
Okay. So first of all, Shrink, my friend and colleague, Anita Kumar Gill, there's a number of things where we're different. A, masculine, feminine. B, male, female. C, she's educated in the Western model as a MD and a psychiatrist. And my education is primarily in the arts and in spirituality and in meditation. And she is Indian from Asia of India, and I'm from the US. So those differences, 99.9% of the time, are complementary. And we add to what each other has and are able to pull out of each other some of the beauty and the strength and the wisdom that doesn't show if we're by ourselves. It takes somebody else to see it and draw it out. So we do that for each other. And our intention is to bring to the people who feel depressed and who feel anxious the power of mindfulness combined with the intelligence and the knowledge of psychiatry and medicine within an online format where people can interact with each other anonymously and be connected to peers who have some of the same symptoms of depression and anxiety, A, so that they learn they're not alone, B, so that there's that sense of peer support and encouragement. While we're practicing mindfulness together, we're looking at the different dimensions of body, speech, and mind and emotions and how those create a negative spiral downward, linking us to deeper depressive states, along with things like mood disorders that come from the psychiatric perspective. So this notion that we're doing is creating a community of sorts, an online community that delves into some of the biggest illnesses of our day. There's 350 million people worldwide who suffer depression, 16 million of them in the US, of which only a third are receiving professional treatment. Part of the reason for that is the stigmatization of depression and mental illnesses or depressive mood disorders. And those hurdles of stigmatization and shame are more easily overcome when people engage in an online format where their anonymity is assured as well as their privacy.
That is currently a program that's up and running now?
Well, we're still in the process of creating the business. The courses are yet to be scheduled. It's likely to be this summer. But there is a Monk and Shrink Facebook page where you can meet Anita and me. And we're in the process of putting up short videos that are about us, including parts of our depression experiences that are, I'm hoping that those indicate to the viewers that, wow, these guys know what they're talking about from the inside.
Well, that sounds like a great system, a great plan. Greg, I want to thank you for joining us today and sharing your story, the ongoing journey.
Yeah, I like that ongoing word in there. Thank you, Rich. So true.
So looking back on your journey so far, what would be one word that you could think of to describe your journey? And do you have any parting words for us?
No, I'm hoping that that quality of silence for a couple of seconds would be understood as my current response. Okay, then the parting words. Let me check. Yeah, I'm going to pretend I'm speaking directly to your listeners. Okay? It helps if you realize you're going to die. It helps you prioritize what you do with your one wild and precious life. Your lifetime and your life energy are limited. What are you going to do with it? I'm not suggesting that you make a decision and then follow through with it as an ironclad commitment. I'm hoping to inspire you to contemplate, to open up to what is the mystery of life and allow something to emerge, something that might surprise you about what's important to you and the direction that you want to follow. Okay, Rich, that's what I've got.
Well, thank you, Greg. That was very beautiful. Beautiful words. Thank you. And it's important. And I first talked to you about, 2 or 3 years ago? why you're not more well known at this point is beyond me, because of your background and your wisdom. Everyone should know who you are.
I hardly know how to take that, except I think I have an answer. Poor businessman skills.
Oh, they don't teach that in the Hermitage?
No, I'm still learning, Rich. That's like a steep learning curve that is so steep, I continuously fall off.
Me too.
But Rich, I appreciate what you're doing with Mindful Accord. I see action happening on your side of the world, and we all benefit from that. And I'm grateful to you.
Well, I'm grateful to you. Thank you so much, Greg. Thank you again for listening. And please leave any comments or suggestions. We're always looking for ways to improve our show and make it the best show it can possibly be. Visit mindfulaccord.com, where you can find additional episodes and you can follow our blog. We give some helpful information on mindfulness, meditation, and just ways to manage our everyday stressful lives. And most importantly, if you know of a friend or a family member that would benefit from this story, please share it with them. Until next time, I'm Rich Decker.